What does the future want? Raphael asked us a question this morning, and I'd been thinking about it because I'd promised to get up here and talk for 18 minutes about what does the future want. And I thought, what does the future want? I wonder what it wants. Immediately realizing that I had anthropomorphized, which is a word I would only dream of saying here at Oxford, because it probably wouldn't go down very well anywhere else. But having made the future a person, and has anyone else in here ever done something like that? Talk to it in a conversational kind of tone? Yeah, a few. I thought, well, what is it? What could the future be like? And so I started thinking about it and drawing up a few pictures of the future. It could be a black hole that's demanding amazing things out of it. This black hole is thanks to NASA. It could be, a blank sheet of paper that we can draw on and create anything we feel like. It could be a desert, the results of human activity on this planet, or maybe something else hitting the planet and the way that we've had other dramas happening. Or it could simply just be itself going on and doing whatever it feels like doing. But this whole inquiry led me down to the next question was, what does my conception of the future do to create it? And I thought, well, I live in a world, this current world, which is a lot about black and white. In fact, there's a fair amount of black and white in the room today, and I know I'm wearing a bit of color for a change. There's this black and white thing in finance about, can you measure it? What does it mean if there's not data, it doesn't really exist. If we start thinking about other sorts of ones, there's just a focus on linearity in so much of our world. And then if we're in business, even if we have a business that's about triple bottom line, it's still about a line of some sort. And then it took me into the next dimension of it. This focus that our world has on this line, this connection between A and B, and one as I, particularly in the more Western-based world that most of us in this room operate in. So I reflected on that one a little bit more, because I had quite a long flight to keep myself occupied and to come over here. And thought, okay, so what else is going on in this world? We've got global warming, climate change, SARS, for anybody who can remember those sorts of things, other sorts of diseases that seem to pop up and race through this world, somewhat like a modern version of the Black Death. We've got increasing obesity. We've got more stress. We've got time that's considered an investment that one then manages and spends and tries to get value out of. We've got quality time. And then in a world where even spending 7 minutes to reflect and be mindful in some environments is considered to be personally indulgent. And I was looking at all of this as a world and thinking, actually, it looks rather dark, rather heavy. And it wasn't really a world that I was particularly enjoying. But, in our little world of black and white, and we're told we could have props, so it's very important to have one's little props of black and white. I looked at it and I thought, how can I take myself out of that space? Because I've certainly had times when I've sat on my veranda in a house that is literally called a black and white, which is an older type of house in Singapore, and reflected on, if this is the world around me, what on earth can I as a single individual do to make any kind of difference in that? What capacity do I have to change the future? Because the future, that demanding creature that's out there, I'm operating here and now. And all this, who really knows? So, having grown up in a very, very scientific environment, I grew up at an international agricultural research station, and let us say, science was just the way it was. We've got some history there. If you can't get the data on it, it probably isn't something we can work with. And then I moved into the professional, corporate environment where we literally were told, leave your emotions outside, be a robot. And so I'm beginning to get a little bit of a sense of possibly why my world is in the particular color it is. But then to challenge that, the world that I'd grown up in was a world where people believed they could take a problem like people starving, 1 billion people starving, and wars being fought on this planet over food, and in 20 years transform the way we had food productions from the 60s forward into a way where that was actually no longer a question. Now, 20, 30 years later, it's a question in another form. But small groups of people yet had managed to change the world in quite substantial ways. And I'm sitting in this world that's rather black. So I'm looking at myself and the future and my capacity to be present right here, right now, with what I'm doing. And I frankly really feeling fairly uncomfortable with it. So I start looking at ways that allow me to open it up into something that's a little different to that. Because what I had also found is that in my world, I was using things like the black and white, like the data, as a great way of avoiding actually being present and being seen. Because that, and this, for me, was a great form of safety. So I started looking around and saying, okay, if I can take that I, that linearity out of it, what might I get? I started exploring a world, and one of those worlds was mentioned earlier this morning at Oxford Futures Forum. We had all these great minds in talking. And there was this focus on, yes, what can we do to influence the physical world? And then that led to a discussion about, yes, there's an emotional world of people that needs to be part of this whole how the world might change. And then there's the mental world, the models that we use and we're often very familiar with from our time at Oxford. And what was interesting was at one stage, people were up there with the flip charts and whiteboards, and someone wrote up in the top corner, values. And then the conversation moved on. And that was the only time in the entire period of this 2-day conference that that particular construct was explicitly mentioned. Which was interesting, because if they're talking about changing the world and values wasn't even something that had any permission to be mentioned in anything other than this minute little footprint, that was a fascinating thing. Because if we move over to another world, another highly rational world, one of the things that we find from quantum science is that one of the most powerful ways of changing physical reality is our intent. What we choose to measure and how we measure it changes physically the world. And so something at the most intangible space had meaning and created elsewhere. So I looked at my life and I realized that in those 4 planes of the physical world, the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual and values world, that I was very comfortable in the physical world and I was very comfortable in the mental world. But those other 2 were places that I had great discomfort in. So I looked at that and thought, okay, well, if I'm talking about trying to change the present now, because that's the only place I get to work in, how many of you think the past is fixed? Anyone in here? No, some people do, some people don't. How about that the present is something that's malleable? Yeah, there's some space there. Anyone? No, it's only in the future? No, some cultural paradigms do have structures like that. And so I was looking at how can I change now? Because that's the easiest place for me to go work in. And I started diving into this whole world of emotions and values. And it created this vastly new space, this space that was, instead of being linear and black and white, that had color and different shape. A desert, thanks to NASA. A world that had infinite possibility in an entirely different way than my rational world had ever constructed and conceived. And that was rather amazing. And my life continued for a bit. And I realized that it was going so far, but other things didn't happen. I reflected and I said, well, I had actually set myself 3 goals when I started on this journey, because I thought, okay, I'm a bit of a scientist, as I've owned up to already. So 3 things that I can use to see whether I'm creating any progress in my own life on that one. Now, may I move off the space of the theoretical and the framework into reality? Is that okay with everyone? Okay. So I set myself 3 goals, and is it okay if I share those goals with you? Okay, so the first one was to find a partner, because that was something that I hadn't had in my life, and the tender age in my early 40s, it was like, well, lots of other people seem to think this is rather good. Maybe they're not nuts. The second one was to create a spiritual journey, a spiritual path for myself, because I thought, if I've got another 50 years on this planet, at least give me something that I know is going to give me some long-term basis to go and explore. And the third, well, we'll go back to that later on. So I start down this journey. And some might say, as I sat on my veranda in my black and white, that the whole thing was framed. But as I got into this, there I realized that what I was looking very comfortable on my veranda. But inside, I was really just comfortably numb. And that the process of denumbing has been one that I have very rarely ever seen talked about, and yet I suspect it's one that most of us in one way or shape or form have had in our own lives. At the intellectual level, if we look at and we say 50% of the population has been in some kind of violent or abusive situation at some stage of their life. That was me. Or carries other sorts of tragedies from other things that happen around. And how many people in this room can relate to some of that? Yeah. And yet, we can focus on the light and the positivity of intent. And there is this dark world, this dark intent that's there. I was finding in my life that I could do some things that other people thought was absolutely amazing. Getting books published at major publishers with a single proposal, evidently incredibly unheard of. I could create intent brilliantly there, but in these other spaces, these three goals, that was a different place. And that pain of those sorts of things carry on, and they create from our past into our present and often into our future as well. But we don't talk about them. The positive intent, that's fine. That dark side of intent that sets other barriers, other rules, isn't touched. For me, I had found that I had not just numbed, I hadn't papered over it. I had repressed it so solidly that brick walls, lead line, only begin to describe as a metaphor how I had dealt with some of the pains. But they came through in the way I connected and tried to relate to anyone. I mean, there's many of you here that I've known for years. And I don't think I've ever had the courage to stand up and really show you anything meaningful of me. Because to show anything inside of me was too intrinsically scary. Too much fear comes up. And too terrifying to even think of that kind of exposure. And yet we're operating in a world where we're trying to connect to other people, influence and create meaning with a vast part, often hidden. The light is something we can talk about, but the dark side of our intent, still part of our reality. So, I decided that there were many ways of approaching it, and staying in that darkness wasn't necessarily going to be a great degree of fun, and that Darth Vader could either vanquish the kitty or be vanquished by. So, in life, I kept exploring and experimenting. I kept on trying to find ways where I would be able to actually stand in front of somebody else, or sit in front, or even be in a conversation where I could actually look at somebody and not actually get up and walk away because it was too scary to be seen and be personal. Because my data, my black and white, was my security blanket. But my data, my black and white, doesn't allow me to relate and connect with another human being and to create any sense of change and meaning right here, right now. So my journey through those particular ones, through the emotional one, let's say a rather amazing roller coaster, through the spiritual one, I think was the thing that gave me the place to keep moving on. Because somehow or other going through that process helped release and deal with some of the things that on the emotional level was making existing so hard. And then in going through that, realizing that I can stand here now. And I can see that there's that dance between light and dark, between the way that we have particular things that create darkness and ignorance, and that the judgment that some of us have put on it, and I say some of us in the sense that definitely, and us, that was me, had put on certain sorts of things, created that block, and that do not discuss, do not raise, do not deal with. And yet that was always in that dance around me. And then I could go and look at other sorts of things that created that sense of awe and amazement, of space, of possibility, of different sorts of colors that can come through and be meaningful. A place where actually I could be here and relate. Where that sense of intent, that sense of capacity to create right now in the present is from intent. And if we want to create any kind of future, that intent's got to be able to deal with both. Because it's here now. And that's what we have to work with. So, my 3 goals. I do want to say there was some progress on them. I met an absolutely wonderful man not long ago. This is him having come out of the seawater at Bondi Beach because he wanted to learn to windsurf in the middle of winter. Okay, he's Canadian, maybe that makes sense in that context. And that's so one of my goals achieved. The spiritual one definitely in process and progress. And on the 3rd one, that was to be able to be comfortable, being seen by people, being able to be here right now with you, with my present being fuzzy with all these things. Thank you.